Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, how is Sri Lanka dealing with its war-torn past? We'll look at the state of human rights and reconciliation in the country. Our digital producer, Omar Badar, is looking out for your live feedback, and today's show is special because it was inspired by a community pitch.
That's right, and we have a lot of people who are tweeting in also from Sri Lanka, and some people are optimistic about this new government's ability to maybe make some progress on reconciliation. We have Abdul Halik over here who says, I feel like people in the present government have much more capabilities to bring about a change, but we also have Anupama here who says there are many systemic issues that still need addressing. It will take not only the government, but civil society and the diaspora as well. Now, what all these people can actually do is part of what we're discussing, and we want your ideas at home as well. So be sure to tweet us using the hashtag AJStream, and we'll get to those tweets during the show.
Now joining us on set, Nimi Gorunathan, Director of the Politics of Sexual Violence Research Initiative. She's studied human rights abuses, including violence against women in Sri Lanka. Via Skype in Colombo, Sri Lanka, we have Ruki Fernando, a human rights activist. Also in Colombo, Niran Ankatau, a human rights lawyer. And in Las Vegas, Nevada, Karu Hangawate. He was a member of Sri Lanka's Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. He was also Sri Lanka's ambassador to France and now teaches criminal justice. Now, before we get started, a bit of background. 6 years have passed since Sri Lanka ended its 26-year war between government forces and separatist Tamil Tigers. But is the country any closer to finding justice for victims of conflict? Well, next month, the UN is expected to release a report on abuses committed during the final stages of the war in 2009. Those abuses were allegedly carried out by both the Sri Lankan military and Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or LTTE. Human rights groups say the country's lack of accountability in addressing wartime crimes has led to a post-conflict environment where violations, including torture and enforced disappearances, are still happening. So today we want to know how Sri Lankans are dealing with the legacy of civil war. And Nimi, I'll start with you. You spoke to several women who experienced horrific things during the war. What were some of the stories that stuck out the most to you?
There's one story that always stands in my head. It was a few years ago, 2 years after the war. There was a woman who was an ex-combatant. She was in the LTT, a Tamil woman who had entered into the detention facilities, and then when she returned back to the resettlement villages, was raped by a member of the military. She got pregnant in that rape and only told her mother, and her mother brought her to a church where she gave birth to the child and lost weight before returning home. Now, in this context, only her mother knew. Her father didn't even know that she had been raped, right? And what struck me the most in sitting with her and her newborn baby at that time was that this woman was outside of her family, outside of the community as someone who had been raped, outside of the village because it was difficult for her to go back there without raising suspicion, and then also as a Tamil, she was outside of the state. So she was in this position of extreme marginalization. And on this trip, when I went back in July, I was able to meet her again, and she was living close to where she was from, but was unable to find any type of work, any sort of livelihood, mostly because the military had taken over a number of these jobs. And she joined something called the Civilian Security Department, which was run by the police in Sri Lanka, and entered into what was a transactional sort of exploitative sex relationship with one of these soldiers in order to earn money. And this story sounds like a story about sexual violence, right? But I think that what we miss here is that it's a story about the layers of repression that the Tamil people are under, and Tamil women in particular. And second, we should be looking at this woman not as a victim, but think about how this has affected her politically, what she thinks now.
Right, well, and that story is tragic, but how common is it?
I think
stories like that.
In various layers, in various levels of this spectrum of violence against women, it is very common. You know, the problem is that we're always looking for this horrific, clear moment of rape, no? But there is a spectrum of sexual violence, and most Tamil women live within a spectrum of vulnerability to violence from a number of different forces.
Ruki, what was your experience in the war or post-war?
Well, I think there has been many situations, stories of individual people like what Nimmi said. I think for me, it has been very striking to work with families of disappeared people who for many years, some for decades, believe that their family members are still alive, kept probably in some secret detention center. I myself suspect whether that is true or not, or whether they have been killed already. But the key thing is that these family members still don't have a final answer. And they've gone to complain before the police, to the National Human Rights Institution, to the various commissions of inquiries. There's one sitting right now appointed by the president, the commission that was Professor Hangangwata was serving, and so many other institutions and so many other individuals, but still they have not found an answer. There are political prisoners who have been in detention for as long as 19 years that I know, without their cases having been concluded. And it's quite possible that their cases could conclude with them being found innocent. So what will happen to them, and who will help them to rebuild their lives that they've lost being detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for so long? And we have stories of land which has been occupied by the military from thousands of acres.
Ruki, I want to stop you there because you mentioned the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and for our audience that's not in Sri Lanka and may not know what that is, can you sum that up briefly?
Well, the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a law that by nature or by words aims to prevent terrorism. But in fact, in practical reality, it has been used extensively to crack down on dissent, on journalists, on human rights activists, opposition politicians, etc. And it has also been used to instill fear into human rights activists, journalists, opposition politicians, any dissenters. And it is a law that allows authorities, the defense establishment, to deal with people, to detain people for very long periods without any checks and balances. It takes away judicial discretion in terms of giving bail and in terms of releasing people who are in detention. So it's a very, very draconian law.
We have people who are describing what life is currently like. We have Boo Radley here who tweeted in an image saying, "A lot still has not been repaired. This is my mother's school, pictured in 2013, and you can still see here a picture of the school with a lot of damage still having not repaired in it." And then we have Nirman Nusan here who says, "This is not a post-conflict era, as the root causes of the conflict have not been addressed appropriately yet." Karu, can you comment on this idea that we're not in a post-conflict era yet? Would you agree with that characterization?
We are in a post-conflict area, but there are some issues still remaining. And let me address a couple of things that were mentioned about sexual violence. Of course, sexual violence is prevalent in many societies, even in Sri Lanka, in many parts of Sri Lanka. It's not just limited to sexual violence against women of a particular communal group, but others as well, and also not intercommunal. It's mostly most of the sexual violence that's reported are intra-communal or intra-family, just like in other countries in Sri Lanka too. I'm not saying that there have been or there are not going to be incidents like that between communities as well. And I know when I was ambassador in France, the father, Catholic father, who was in charge of the Tamil congregation there, he was telling me he said he hardly had any free time. He was all the time counseling families. There was a lot of violence with the families and breakups and various other things that he had to counsel them on, and he was busy from morning till late night, he was telling me. And I don't know whether it's, I have no idea, because it may also be that they were affected by war, and they are, because they were displaced, and all those may have, yes, please.
I appreciate that perspective, but it's one that I hear a lot from men around the world, that sexual violence happens everywhere, and therefore we don't have to address it in this particular context.
No, that's
sir,
not what I said. I
have actually in the past year conducted an extensive research study alongside a number of academics to examine the current issues of sexual violence in Sri Lanka right now in the North and East, for a report that will be coming out actually this Friday. And what it finds is that yes, there is violence within the Tamil community. There is also continuing threat of violence from the military presence in the north, but everything must be contextualized. It cannot be painted under one banner of sexual violence affects everybody. Tamil women are particularly vulnerable to both violence by the state and violence from a war-traumatized community. There's been a breakdown of society in the north. There's been a rise in alcoholism. There's been a rise in depression amongst young men. The community itself has fallen apart, and militarization seeps into the social fabric in a way that makes women vulnerable to violence from multiple angles. By just saying sexual violence happens across the island, completely depoliticizes the question and removes the question of targeted violence and the specific context that Tamil women are under right now.
And Nimi, what you're saying seems to back up the claims of human rights advocates say that this violence is still happening. Karu, I know that you want to respond to that. I'll give you a line to respond to that, and then I want to bring Niran in here.
Very quickly. I didn't mean to say that therefore it is okay. I never even intended to say that. I don't know where that comes from. And having said that, it is one thing to politicize this. It's another thing to treat it as a problem of violence, crime in society, because some military members, ex-military members, have even committed sexual violence against women in the southern areas as well, and there have been reports, and they come all the time, even killings. And so these have to be, we have to have a perspective correctly. Is it the military policy? Is it the governmental policy? Are they driven by some policy-wise? And then you can politicize it.
So Niran, I want to bring you in here off of the back of what Karu is saying. Clearly, whether it's in the south or the north, people are saying that violations are still happening. So with that in mind, are we actually moving forward in Sri Lanka towards reconciliation and towards justice for the victims of these crimes that you heard Nimi talk about and elsewhere across the country?
Well, I think all we can say now is that there is an opportunity, but I think some of the discussion that we've already had on this program indicates that perhaps there's a difference of opinion as to exactly how bad the situation is in Sri Lanka. And this is why human rights advocates are asking not just for investigations into atrocities committed during the war, but also that credible investigations deal with what's going on after the war. You know, the commission that Professor Angavatta sat on did hear extensive testimony from the north and east. They heard only one incident of rape. And the person who then complained of rape at that commission was later summoned at the fourth floor of the CID for an investigation. And this was revealed after she came forward, indicating a very clear incident of suppression, of threat with respect to those who spoke out. Now, does this mean that it is impossible that Sri Lanka makes progress? Certainly not. I think the new government has made a stated commitment to accountability and reconciliation, but the proof is going to be in the eating. And I think that's why it's important that the world keeps the focus on Sri Lanka, that it ensures that any process in Sri Lanka is not the type of process that we've seen in the past, but that there is a dramatic break, that international standards are maintained, that witnesses are protected in a way that they were not previously, and that really remains to be seen as to whether the government is serious about carrying that sort of a process out.
And when Niran mentions elections and a new government, we saw presidential elections in January and parliamentary elections in August. Earlier this month, we have a new prime minister and a new president in Sri Lanka. Omar.
So just specifically on the point of people being afraid to speak out for potential consequences, Janani says effective prosecution cannot take place on Sri Lankan soil because witnesses to mass atrocities are not safe and cannot speak out. And then we have this video comment from London. Take a listen to this.
Given the dominance of singular Buddhist ideology on Sri Lankan politics and the fact that it considers the Sri Lankan army to be protectors of the singular Buddhist order in Sri Lanka, can we ever expect a domestic mechanism or even a hybrid mechanism that sits partly within Sri Lankan constitutional structure to deliver on true accountability for the victims in Sri Lanka? Thanks.
So, Roki, what do you think of this idea that any potential, even hybrid mechanism for justice, if the Sri Lankan government is involved in it, then some people have hesitation about its ability to actually deliver justice to anyone?
Well, I think the confidence of victims and their families, a large number of them are Tamil, but there are also Muslim and Sinhalese victims of abuses by various parties. So their confidence has to be there. And they have to be involved in the process of not just coming in as victims and witnesses, but they also have to be involved in the process of setting up any mechanism up. Anything that is not set up with their confidence will probably not work. And that's what we had seen in the past. And that's also why I think we need a very strong, independent victim and witness protection mechanism. Although there was a law passed, there hasn't anything really that happened with regard to it up to now. Hopefully something will happen in the coming weeks and months. But what is key is, I think, victims' participation and their involvement in the kind of mechanism that will be set up.
Karu?
May I? Yes. On what Niran said, that one case that came before the commission, I want to just correct what was said. Niran was not wrong, but his impression is wrong. That person, that woman, I know this case, was summoned by the CID because we handed over investigations to the CID to make sure that if a police officer or someone else had committed the violation, that they can take action against them. But after this came up, of course, we told thereafter for the CID to either travel to north, east, to the district secretary's offices, because going to their homes also may intimidate them, and or whichever that they preferred, and to conduct investigations. So it was really a misunderstanding there, and we never assumed, we never thought, but we were wrong. We should have really taken that step initially, but it's just that that's the way that the CID generally operates.
And Karo, of course, we appreciate the specifics. And when you mention the Criminal Investigation Department, that's the CID that you referenced. That's
yes.
The Sri Lankan police. But I don't want to go into specific cases because I want to make sure this is as broad enough for our international audience as possible. So I want to go to my computer now. This is my laptop. This is what the new president, Sirisena, tweeted on the 23rd of August. The president handed over the land deeds to 234 war-displaced families in Sempur, and that's in the country's east. So this is showing, or attempts to show, progress. Ruki, do you see this as progress?
Yes, compared to what it was for the last many years till 2014, there is some progress. But compared to what's been happening and what's going on, in a way, it's not progress because, like, for example, just yesterday I was in the north, in Mana, and I was talking to families of people whose lands have been occupied illegally by the army, by the police, and by the navy till today. And the navy is adamantly refusing to give back those lands. And that's prime land for these people who have been living there for generations. And also they have the legal deeds to it. It's next to the beach, and these people are fisherfolk. So there are lots of areas like that that has to be dealt with. And we have also seen continuing violations that going on in the last couple of months. There have been people who have been detained under the PTA. There have been at least one person that I know of who was abducted and tortured very badly, including sexually abused while in detention, in a secret kind of a detention facility. He still doesn't know where he was held.
Ruki, I have to stop you there because you mentioned the PTA again, and of course you were also detained under the PTA. I have a page up on my computer now that had a hashtag for you, people calling for you to be released back in March of 2014. Are you still facing investigation?
Yes, I'm still under, me and my colleague who was arrested with me is still under the investigation of the Terrorist Investigation Department. I still face a restriction on speaking about the circumstances surrounding my arrest. My equipment that was confiscated about 1.5 years ago still has not been returned. There was a travel restriction on me that compelled me to seek court permission each and every time I went overseas for any human rights related or any even personal thing. That was permanently revoked by the courts on 30th of June. Yet in July when I traveled, I was still stopped, and it needed special interventions by my lawyers at 6 in the morning to allow me to travel. So it shows that the security establishment has not necessarily changed its ways of operating. And that is, I think I would consider myself among the luckier victims of the PTA. Many other people have not been as lucky as me to get the kind of support that I got, which enables me to be free. And in fact, the lady that was a kind of a trigger for me being arrested, Jay Kumari, was also released after 362 days, conditionally released. She's also still under investigation. and she still has to go to the police and sign once a month. And like I said right at the beginning, there are people who are in detention up to 19 years without their case not having been concluded. There are people who have been in detention from 2006 who have not yet been charged. They are still a suspect. And a couple of months ago, there was a lady who was released after more than 6 years in detention and after having been tortured, and she was released as innocent. But there's absolutely no support. There's absolutely no reparation for what she had to go through. And there's absolutely no sympathy from society, from the community, from the government to the fact that she was detained for more than 6 years while her 3 children had to fend for themselves.
And Ruki,
So
you mentioned Jayakumari, so I pulled up a tweet on my screen here. This is Jayakumari released on bail. This was tweeted back in March. Omar.
We have some people also who are talking about what it will take to actually get the government to budge on this in a more serious way. We have Prabhu here who tweeted in saying the previous regime was only interested in reconciliation because of international pressure, but there was no political will. Goes on to say that other than rhetoric, there had been nothing, no political will or commitment towards justice or reconciliation. Nimi, what will it take? What kind of pressure will it take to make sure that the government response is going to be more than something that is just for show, to actually achieve something substantive?
Right, so let's say for show, and I can say as a specific example, I was leaving from the Jaffna airport a couple of weeks ago, and there was 3 branches of the military and all of their finery sort of lined up at the airport, maybe hundreds and hundreds of people in this sort of, gear to allow this one military commander to come in and release these lands. Now, meanwhile, the past couple of weeks, when you talk about land, which is a critical issue right now in Sri Lanka, one, the housing that was given by the Indians, there was 50,000 houses. Women don't have their names on the titles for that, too. What about the land that's already been taken over, that's been turned into the agricultural farms that the military runs, that's been taken over for hotels that only military families are allowed to use on the prime properties in the beach? These spaces that are already occupied by the military become a physical threat to women. No, it reroutes the path of their daily life, right? And I think when you're talking about international justice and what it's going to take for this to happen, we've gotten stuck in this sort of international domestic, which one is it going to be, right? In some senses, both are very, very difficult, and both are going to be very challenging to have happen. I think the questions that are not being asked, what happens with all these people who you meet in the North and East, all these average civilians, ex-combatants who say they've completely lost faith in the United Nations, in the state, in the political system, in politics in general, right? That you have this community that doesn't believe in engaging anymore because it's gotten them nowhere, who can't report the very basic crimes because there's nobody who speaks Tamil at the police station, right? What does it mean for these people? And if there is going to be an accountability, who's going to be accountable? Just the Sri Lankan government, just the Tigers? Or is the US going to be accountable? Is the UN going to be accountable? Is India going to be accountable? The people who knew what was going on in the final stages of the war. What kind of accountability is it? Without answering those questions, the mechanism itself becomes less important.
Niran, do you think those questions will be answered?
I don't think there's any way of knowing that now. I think we have to wait and see. But what I am confident of is that in the event we see the kind of sustained pressure we have seen on the Sri Lankan government over the next 5 years, there will be improvement. If, however, the international community takes the position that you have a more friendly government in Colombo, and therefore there is no need for international pressure, then I feel that there is a certain possibility of a backsliding. And just to illustrate this point, early in the days of the new regime, in the heady days of post-Rajapaksa politics in January 2015, the foreign minister and the spokesman of the cabinet both independently spoke of the possibility of foreign judges serving in a sort of hybrid court system, though they didn't reference the word. Now, I wonder whether that sort of concession is still on the table. And my sense is that perhaps it is not. And if it is not, then I suggest that the reason for that is that the government senses that there is a diminution in the pressure that they're facing, that there is perhaps not the same kind of need to reach out and to demonstrate its bona fide.
Well, Niran, we will pick up on that need and whether there is one to reach out to those communities in our post-show. And I think you raised an interesting comment there that we will discuss. That's all the time we have for now. Conversation continues. Stream.aljazeera.com. Welcome back. This is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about human rights and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Let's get right back to that conversation. Niran, I had to wrap you up there, but explain to us in about a sentence what you were saying so we can pick up on that point.
Well, I think the question of how useful the domestic mechanism or in-country mechanism is going to be is entirely contingent on a couple of things. First, how intense is the pressure the government faces from the international community? And I think if the pressure is sufficiently intense, this government that is trying to court the international community, that is trying to court the West and those who are applying that pressure or were applying that pressure, I think will be forced to deliver on something rather than nothing. And secondly, it's a question of political will. I think there are some people in the government who would like to make progress. The question is whether they're able to, whether they are going to be willing to inform the military that things are not going to be the same way again. Whether they are going to be able to reform Sri Lanka's institutions to create the kind of justice structures that could deliver on justice and not just act as a fig leaf. And thirdly, whether they are going to be able to inform and explain to their own constituency, to the Sinhala constituency, the need to reach out to the Tamil community and the need to, more than just reaching out to the Tamil community, do justice by Sri Lanka's citizens, which is something that it needs to do now that we have 60 years of bloodletting against a number of different communities, but the Tamil community is certainly facing the brunt of it.
If I could jump in just with one comment that, another thing we have to be cautious of is the West's tendency to sometimes supplement rights for development. And I think it's something that's we see in Sri Lanka a lot. The narrative of development supersedes that of human rights, and I think, throwing sewing machines and chickens and cows and paving a couple of roads is not going to end this conflict. And militarized development is also not going to be the way into an actual reconciliation here.
So we have people who are also discussing in our online community other solutions, not just talking about the judicial part. I mean, obviously that's going to be a big part of it, but other things that could be done in the meantime. We have Sudhar Shan over here who tweeted in saying, 6 years after mass atrocities, soldiers responsible for potential crimes are still situated in the Tamil areas. Goes on to say the military is involved in land grabs, running farms and businesses that further marginalize the Tamil community, and suggests that maybe committing to demilitarizing the Northeast in the Tamil-speaking regions. Karu, is that a possibility in the meantime until some kind of judicial justice can be achieved?
Complete demilitarization of a part of the country is, I don't think, we can see that it will happen. It hasn't happened in any country. It doesn't happen in any country. I think, if I may just offer something with the view to the future, something that we heard during our sittings of the Commission, which we conducted publicly, privately, as well as with impromptu hearings. One thing we heard from almost everyone, ordinary people I'm talking about, not the so-called experts and others, ordinary people, they all, whether they were Tamil, Sinhalese, Muslim, they gave one message to us. They told us that we have suffered enough. We don't want another war, again, this type of violence, and we want to live in a united country, free, as in one nation, as free, with freedom and dignity. I think that's what people want. So to provide that, I believe we have to have a political solution. We have to. And these kinds of political solutions they are talking about, I don't know whether they will work. We have to somehow develop some kind of consensus to create a society where the rule of law, what I mean by rule of law is the principle of legality, under which laws that are illegitimate or vague are considered illegal, and where fundamental fairness and governance by a plurality will prevail.
So Karu, if that's what people want, you were on a commission, you released a report in 2011, your commission did at least, and you take a look at my laptop here, several actions were completed, and that included things like disarmament, ensuring the rights for people with disabilities, freedom of movement for the media. It's now 2015. Has more been done? Are we any closer to giving those people what they want?
Not everything has been done. We made a series of recommendations. I think we made about almost 300 recommendations, if I remember right, 280 or about 300. And we knew also at the time some of those recommendations, it will take time. We have had a protracted 30-year conflict, and you can't expect things to be changed overnight unless there's a revolution. And they take time. But there were certain recommendations we made that could be addressed quickly, changing certain administrative regulations, procedures, military practices, police practices, some of those things, and the land. Land was a major problem. We spent a lot of time on land, and some have been taken, and thousands of displaced people were resettled. And now still some are still being given, because that's a huge problem. I don't have time here to discuss. It's not just a matter of the government, not just the land laws. The laws are also different in the north and the south when it comes to land.
So Karo, when you said that,
Niran
really wanted to jump in. Niran, what did you want to say?
Well, I think that the question of land really tells you a lot about this duality between, on the one hand, the perception of progress, and on the other, the very serious problems of continuing violations. I happen to represent, as a junior counsel in a case representing 2,000 victims whose land was expropriated by the military. In fact, in an area called Valihamam, there's 6,000 acres of land, which is an area which is about 2/3 the size of Colombo city, has been entirely taken over the land for its use, including by putting up hotels run by the military, golf courses, convention centers, and farming. Now, after this government came into power, 1,000 acres, which is about 1/6 of that land, has been released. And in fact, that's very welcome. I mean, that's progress. But 5/6 of the land has not. And I think the question really is, does this government that is currently in place have the right pull factors and push factors that will induce it to convince the military to give up the land that it now enjoys and is making profit out of? And from what we're hearing, the government may be willing, but the problem is at the stage of the military. And that's really the question. Do we have a government in place that is sufficiently convinced that this agenda takes sufficient importance that it must push the military to do that which it would otherwise not do? And I think that's an open question. And a lot of it depends on how much pressure we can generate from within the country through our mechanisms, but also how much pressure can be generated from outside the country. And that's where Sri Lanka's international partners.
I just wanted to backtrack to one point that Karo had made about hearing from a lot of ordinary people about saying that they just want this conflict to end. And we have an interesting question here from Itapalag, who says, we need a greater focus on what we as regular Sri Lankan citizens can do in our daily lives, and then tweeted along this photo with "I can change Sri Lanka" as a hashtag. Nimi, if you wanted to just speak to an ordinary Sri Lankan who wants to see some progress in the country, what would you tell them?
I think the ordinary citizen in Sri Lanka doesn't have a lot of power, particularly women. They don't have a lot of political power, right? And I think when we talk about these big ideas, right, about justice and accountability and war crimes, and as important as it is to unearth these mass graves, which we know exist, and the secret camps, which we know exist, we also have to think about, what does justice look like for these people on the ground? No, I mean, most of the women that I've talked to, you have this mother, Karu noted that people have suffered. People are suffering. That's the point that has to be made. People are suffering, and you haven't even dealt with the reason why they suffered, and they continue to suffer. This mother who's walking around with a photograph of her son who has disappeared 6-7 years ago, right? Who believes that she sees him in every photograph that she sees in the newspaper, and she believes that he's still alive, or her husband, or whoever it is that's missing, right? That not knowing in itself is a human rights violation, right? To have to live every day and think, are they dead? Are they alive? Or falsely believe that they're alive? Are they missing? Are they detained, right? What that looks like for them. And the militarization, one of the reasons that, anybody in the government would argue they have to keep it there is they're worried about a resurgence of violence. They're worried about something like the Tigers coming back. What they're not recognizing is that these things that are affecting people's everyday lives, particularly Tamil women, is where the conversation started from in the first place. These are the things that are the drivers of violence. When you have women being raped, when you have people unable to get jobs, when you have people stop going to school, when you have no political agency, that's what causes violence, right? So it is counterintuitive, the fact that militarization is what they intend to use to prevent violence.
Well, Ruki, you heard Niran earlier say that the only way any change will be affected is if we, meaning the Sri Lankan people, pressure their leaders. And then you heard Nimi say, unfortunately, the Sri Lankan people don't have that much power. I'll give you the last word on this, Ruki. What's your take?
Well, I think I don't entirely agree with Nimmi. I think people all over the world do have lots of power. It doesn't always come to a realization. Like I said before, I work with families of disappeared people. I work very closely with wives of people who've been detained, and they've made lots of effort, and they've been able to make small differences. And I think in the broader context of things, on the 8th of January, many Sri Lankan people went to vote, and they were able to make a difference. So I think in variety of occasions and instances, we've seen that ordinary people, families of human rights violations, survivors of violence, they are very powerful, and they are forced
I'm
to
sorry,
be reckoned
to
with.
correct myself,
And
I think what the word I meant to use was political agency. I think that we don't recognize the agency of victims. I certainly believe most of my work is about how Tamil women in particular have political power, but the spaces are not often provided for them to access real change.
Well, they've been taking, I think, the center stage as much as they can. Not all of them, but many of them. And they've been trying to create open spaces for themselves without having other people make spaces available for them. But of course, they need to be supported. There has to be people who are sensitive to their cries and struggles. As long as their cries and their struggles falls on deaf ears and no one recognizes it, then of course we are unlikely to see much progress. So that is why it's particularly important that the international community at this junction in September does not abandon the stories of the victims that is contained in the report of the UN that will be published in September. And they have to have a commitment to move on from there and to engage in some follow-up action, and not just say that this is the end of the story and we'll move on to do something else somewhere else. There has to be a consistency in terms of continued engagement.
Of course, and I think that's a point that all of our guests can agree on. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we will revisit this issue online, where we always have these conversations with #AJStream, particularly in September, as Ruki mentioned, when the UN report is due to come out. Omar, I'll give the community our last word.
Sure, we have a closing thought from Rad Voice, who says reconciliation is impossible without critical self-reflection on all sides. And we also have a word of caution here from Sivali, who commented on our page, saying Sri Lanka is the motherland of all her sons and daughters, irrespective of tribe and ethnicity. If communities feel disenfranchised, the conflict could reignite sooner rather than later. Something I think all of us want to avoid.
Definitely. I want to thank all of our guests, our community, Nimi Gaurinathan, Ruki Fernando, Niran Ankatel, and Karu Hangawati. Thanks for being here, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.